Joining me now is Liberal Senator James Paterson, who has just been announced the chair of the powerful Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. He, of course, replaced Andrew Hastie, who has become a minister. Congratulations, James. Good to see you. Thanks for joining me. Before I move on to China,
it's good to be with you.
Before I move on to China and the Intelligence Committee, I just want to get your comment on my editorial and on this plan, by the International Criminal Court to pursue Israel. Do you think they're unfairly targeting Israel?
Sharri, I thought your editorial summed up the issues with the ICC very well. 2 years ago, the Prime Minister gave his so-called negative globalism speech to the Sydney Institute, where he talked about the fact that as a regional power with global interests, Australia has largely benefited from the multilateral system set up after World War II. But sometimes these multilateral organisations engage in behaviour which does them no credit, and it really undermines the support for that system. And the ICC's behaviour over the weekend perfectly illustrates that point. The Prime Minister also said in that speech that Australia would always call out anti-Semitism masquerading as concern for human rights. And that's exactly what Maurice Payne has done today with that statement. The ICC has concocted an artificial jurisdiction over Israel and Palestine, which does not exist, which is a legal fiction, and we should call that out. The ICC is not bending over backwards to find jurisdiction to investigate human rights abuses against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the worst human rights abuse in our lifetimes and probably the worst human rights abuse since the Holocaust. And I think that is a permanent stain on them.
Absolutely. We hear and read media reports all the time about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, but where are the international bodies on this?
Exactly. Whether it's the ICC or the Human Rights Council or others, when they single out Israel for disproportionate focus and scrutiny, and when they say little or nothing about shocking atrocities like what's happening in Xinjiang, we heard only last week from the BBC about systematic sexual abuse, rape and torture taking place in those camps, then that tells you everything you need to know about the motivations of these bodies.
Look, continuing on China, you've obviously just taken over as the new chair of the Powerful Intelligence Committee. There has been a renewed focus under Andrew Hastie on China, on its foreign influence operations, its espionage, hacking. What do you plan to pursue during your term as chair?
Sharri, there's a range of things the committee will be looking at. As a starting point, the role of the committee is to keep Australians both safe and free. Safe by making sure that our security agencies are well resourced and well equipped with the necessary powers to go after terrorist organisations and people seeking to engage in foreign interference in our democracy. And free by making sure that those extraordinary powers that we grant the security agencies are used appropriately and properly and within the law. And so that's really the core work of the committee. In terms of some specific inquiries, one of them is going to be into foreign interference at Australian universities. And that inquiry was referred to the committee by the government following your reporting about the 1,000 Talents program and the fact that many of our universities seem not to be on top of their own researchers' involvement in that. And, of course, high-profile issues like the Drew Pavlou affair at University of Queensland, the Elaine Pearson incident at the University of New South Wales, and, frankly, too many to mention.
Well, in terms of that university inquiry, I noticed the submissions have started flowing in. You know, the evidence that you're seeing already, how concerned are you about, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in our academic research and the theft of that intellectual property, in many cases, it seems, to take it back to China to, further modernise their military, even though, and I always have to stress this was not the intention of the Australian researchers who produced the work. It has a dual purpose.
Exactly. Look, I'm very concerned about this, Sharri. The government is concerned, the parliament is concerned. It's the whole reason why universities were included in the Foreign Relations Bill, which passed late last year, which gives the federal government the power to cancel agreements between our universities and foreign universities in authoritarian countries, exactly because we're concerned about these sorts of arrangements. Unfortunately, we've seen too many high-profile arrangements where universities perhaps naively entered into these arrangements unbeknownst to the fact that Xi Jinping, for example, has a military civil fusion philosophy, which is that there is no real distinction between industrial commercial activity and military applications. He always tries to fuse the two. And unfortunately, our universities have entered into relationships with some of these entities, and I think that does come at the real cost of our national interest and our regional security.
Look, one of the other inquiries you've got going on is into extremist groups. How much of a concern is this in Australia? Obviously, we've seen, some recent acts of concern overseas. But in Australia, is this a problem that's under the surface that we just don't know about, or is it something that perhaps was an issue in the past?
So the committee's been referred an inquiry into extremism and radicalism, and it will look at some of the more traditional forms of extremism that we're familiar with in this country, like Islamist extremism, which has been the focus of our security agencies for some time. And it will also look at newer forms of extremism, which are getting an increasing level of focus from ASIO and other federal agencies, like white nationalist or neo-Nazi or white supremacist extremism. Thankfully, Australia has been largely immune from these sorts of incidents on domestic soil. The Islamist terrorist incidents that we've had have been largely low technology, lone wolf style attacks, although our agencies have successfully thwarted much larger scale, more sophisticated attacks that could have had a very serious loss of life. And we've also largely been free of that white nationalist, white supremacist violence as well. But there are signs that that is on the growing in Australia, and it is tracking international trends. So we do need to remain on top of both of those challenges, and that's exactly why the committee is having this inquiry.
Look, finally, before you go, I just want to get your take on the Biden administration's approach to China. There have been mixed views in the national security community about the direction that this will go in. What's your take on it?
Sharri, I'm immensely heartened by the early signs that we're seeing out of Washington, D.C. in the first few weeks of the Biden administration. Firstly, in the appointments that he's made, when he's appointing people like Tony Blinken and Kurt Campbell, Jake Sullivan, Rush Doty, many others, from the top down to the middle of those political appointments. If you are looking for Democrats who are more sceptical of the Chinese Communist Party than these people, you couldn't find them. And in their confirmation hearings before the US Senate, they repeated their long-standing public concerns about the behaviour of the Chinese Communist Party. And just in the last few days, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, in the readout that the State Department provided of his first phone call with his Chinese counterpart, every single one of the issues that he raised with his counterpart was issues of concern that Australia has, like Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan and regional security and stability. There was none of this talk of a compromise, of a reset, of a grand bargain. There wasn't even talk of areas of cooperation or collaboration between the United States and China, like climate change potentially. It was all issues of concern, and that is a really strong early signal that the Biden administration is going to continue in a bipartisan way the very strong stances that the Trump administration took.
That's good news to hear, and we'll have to see if that does turn out to be the case. James Paterson, good luck in your new role, and look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thanks, Sharri.